Tell you what, these guys just never fail to disappoint. So anytime Alireza Firouzja plays Levon Aronian, it's just absolute fireworks, especially in these Armageddon games. So their classical game was drawn in Norway Chess 2020. This is round 7. So Alireza now has the white pieces. He's in a must-win situation, but he has 10 minutes on the clock versus Levon's 7. So let's see what he could do here. We had some madness on the board and an awesome time scramble at the end. So we had these standard moves here, but instead of going in for bishop c4 or bishop b5, Alireza goes knight to c3. Now the openings are less important in blitz, and we see that in a moment. Knight f6, Alireza just goes h3. You know, he's just playing chess here. So bishop e7 from Aronian. Bishop b4 is slightly more active there, but he does like these closed setups. And now bishop b5 from Alireza was followed by the more modest pawn to d6. You can plant the knight on d4 there, and if you play like that, you actually prevent white's next move, which is pawn d4, striking at the center. And now Alireza has a good game here. We can see he's got his pieces nicely centralized, but black is very solid, still a good position. So bishop d7 played, breaks the pin, and now Alireza could swap some pieces on c6 here, but he plays for this policy of keeping pieces on the board. We'll see that throughout the game. He wants to keep tension, push for a win. So the knight drops back. Now both players castled. The pawn came to a6, it kicks the bishop back, and you don't really want to drop it to c4 or a4, then you're running into pawn b5, so it comes back to d3 here. Pawn b5 anyway from Aronian, gaining space, good move. And now pawn a3 also stops this one coming to b4, kicking the knight, weakening the protection of e4. So knight e5 now from Aronian. He's going to pick up that bishop pair, but Alireza's trying to create complications. So he goes knight g3, and after Aronian picks up that bishop, he doesn't actually recapture with the queen. I mean, this looks the most natural move, but then white's got 2 pawn islands, black's got 2 pawn islands, it's less dynamic. So he takes with the pawn. He's constantly trying to mix it up, imbalance the game. We'll see that throughout. After the pawn takes, we had pawn to c5 from Aronian, and this is a great move. He liberates that backwards pawn. Yes, this one's now a backwards pawn and there's a hole on d5, but it's a good space gaining move, takes control of d4, and it's hard for white to actually take advantage of this hole. I mean, for example, if you go bishop to g5, looking to trade bishop for knight, sink a knight in, well actually black can just go h6. If you swap, the bishop swaps, it's hit a monster diagonal, b4 is coming, this one can always cover d5, so you can't really take advantage of this square as white in this position. So instead of moving that bishop out, here Alireza goes queen to f3. So he's looking to actually bring his knight to f5, and I preferred rook to e8 for Aronian here, because after bishop to e6, knight f5, he trades that one off, but of course he's lost the tempo. He could have already had the rook on e8 here. But okay, still very solid. Queen d7 played. As you might have guessed, Alireza retreats. He doesn't want to swap those queens. So it comes back to f3. Now this rook hit the e-file. And now Alireza goes for a slightly dubious plan. Best here would have been something like bishop to d2 or rook to e1. Just kind of standard developing moves. He plays knight to e2. And after Aronian brings this rook into the game, this knight hits g3, heading for f5, but the very simple pawn g6 stops that move, and now where is that knight actually heading? It has to come back really. So black has more than equalised here, even doing slightly better really. So rook e1 from Alireza, he wants pawn e5, so Aronian goes queen e6, he covers that move. If you now do it, well, you can actually drop the knight to d7. That's the square that the queen just vacated as well. And there's a pin down here, so you can't actually take here. Black will soon win the pawn. No good for white. So after queen e6, we had bishop d2, normal development. The knight hit d7, bishop c3. And now bishop f6 from Aronian, a good move, challenging that dark squared diagonal, just trying to trade pieces once again, steer the game towards a draw. And now a great move by Alireza. Can you see the best move in the position? It's nothing flashy, but it's just simple positional chess. And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button, let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss a future video. So here Alireza played knight e2. One of the most basic positional principles is improve your worst piece. That knight was going nowhere from here, so after a captures on c3, it swings around back into the game. However, did Alireza capture with the knight? No, he didn't. Now this is a good move, of course, it looks at d5, but one of the problems is this knight can always cover the square from b6 or f6. Black's going to try and trade queens off. Again, it's harder to mix it up. So Alireza takes with the pawn, more dynamic, more imbalanced. Now it's not such a great move, because after queen f6, again he ducks the exchange, but now he's running into pawn c4. Pawn d5 was also good. Similar themes that you're just breaking down this white pawn structure, and this e4 pawn is now very weak. So if you kick on with d4, well, the rook simply picks up on e4. So Alireza takes on c4 here, and now Levon jumps in, captures with the rook. We can see that black is superior. This pawn's looking weak, so is this one in the future. This one's attacked. So it was defended with f3. The queen came to e5, again looking to exchange. Alireza ducks it, but now the queen exchange is unavoidable. Queen c5 from Aronian. The queen's pinned to the king here. You can't get out of that. So the rook came to the d file, hits this backwards pawn, and now again Aronian's just very hasty to keep steering the game towards a draw. He could go say knight to b6 here, for example, but he immediately snaps off the queens, the king recaptures, and then he goes knight to c5. Still looks nice for Aronian. So he's giving this pawn if white wants it, but if Firouzja were to capture that one, well then there's a nice tactic of actually taking on e4 here. If the pawn recaptures, we can take with the knight, we're forking king and rook, black is emerging a pawn up. So Alireza didn't take this one on d6, instead he went rook d4, and again Levon was just a bit hasty to exchange here. He could go rook a4, for example. If white trades, then you take back on your terms. You leave this one as a backwards target. But Levon captures here, trying to steer this towards a draw, but he gives white these nice central pawns. Now check was played. The king came to e3. Both players are super low on time now, really playing on seconds. Now this knight comes to b2, it's heading for this c4 square, and that's why Alireza didn't play rook to c1 here. He goes rook a2 instead, so that after check, king d3, he's keeping these ideas of a4 alive. And that's why Levon goes knight to b6. He wants to cover this breaking move. Alireza now brings his knight in, it comes around to c3, the rook hit the c file here, and now an excellent move from Alireza, pawn to f4. He wants to get that central pawn mass going, try and create a passed pawn, or create some threats around the king, but Levon responds in kind with a brilliant move. He goes pawn f5. And one of the reasons this is such a great move is that you now take away this e4 square from the knight. We can see how dangerous that knight might have got if it hit that square, hopping around. But now if white captures here, well, we recapture, we've taken the square. This pawn's also isolated and weak. So Alireza kicks on here, and Levon responds with king to f7. He doesn't actually mind if this one's captured, then he can march in like this, he'll recoup the pawn, and he's got a nice position. So Alireza doesn't shatter his pawns. He goes pawn to g4 instead. The king came to e6. There was a capture on f5 with check. The pawn recaptured, and now the rook swings across to g2. Great play by Alireza using that newly opened file. He needs to keep mixing it up here. But knight d5, excellent move from Aronian. So he's going for counterplay in the centre. And in combination with the rook on the c file, this is tricky for white. Now Alireza once again keeps tension on the board, moves the knight away, but he actually had to take here as the best move. Now it wasn't the best move for the circumstances, but it was technically the best move from a chess perspective. Now this kind of thing should be heading towards a draw. Rook g5, say rook c4, you can have this pawn exchange, king c3, should technically be a draw with best play, but it's a rook endgame, very hard to win. So what does Alireza do? He goes knight to e2, but this is a blunder. Can you see the winning move for black here? So the move to play, which Aronian unfortunately missed, is rook to c3 check. Now it looks like you're just hanging it to the knight, but then we've got this simple fork, and you've also won a pawn. And by the way, if you duck your king to d2, well, we just pick up on a3. This is the problem. Once again, you're a pawn ahead. So that would have been excellent, but Aronian missed it. He went rook to c2 here. Now again, you're giving a rook. This time you're checking from e3, and you're picking up the rook like that. But again, this is quite drawish. I mean, the king can come away to b3, you pick up the rook. It might look like white is getting somewhere, about to eat these pawns, but actually then the knight can come to e3. It also could have come to e1. And the point is, if you go king f5, a5 rather, then there's knight c2 hitting this one. Black's in time to come back, save his pawns, pick up the white pawn. So it's no good for white. You can't really create winning chances there. So Alireza didn't take that rook on c2. Instead, he went rook g7. He keeps mixing it up. This rook came to a2, hits the pawn. Alireza picked up here. We had a check here on a3. The king gave ground, rook a2, and now you can't keep shuffling back and forth. The draw's no good, so the king comes to the back rank. And now here the best move for Aronian was pawn to b4. The reason he wouldn't have played this was because of rook h6 check. And then after, say, king e7, white can take here with check, but king d7, actually that pawn's going nowhere. If you ever check again, well, we'll pick up the pawn, and black's one is coming really quickly down the board here. But instead of going pawn b4 immediately, he takes on e5 so as not to lose that pawn after rook h6 check. But Alireza checks anyway, the king gives ground, now captures on e5, and rook a4 hits this backwards f-pawn. So black is still doing well, but hasn't got that b-pawn going. That would have been a lot more dangerous for white to deal with. So king d2 from Alireza. He doesn't go passive with rook h4. Great move. The knight picks up here, but here's Alireza's point. He goes knight to g3. He's coming into f5, keeps mixing it up. Rook a2 check played, and the king starts marching in now. Looks kind of scary for black. The king now comes to d4 after that knight check, but rook d2 check. Great move from Levon. Holds the knight, king c5, and although white might look aggressive, actually black's got it under control, because knight e3 is a great move. You're threatening rook d5 check to pick up this one. So after Alireza takes here, we had check on d5, the king gave ground, and then Levon picked up here, and he's actually a pawn ahead now. How on earth can Alireza win this one? Well, the draw looks most likely now, or even a win to Levon. So rook a7 check played, king f6, the knight came back to e2, and now the best move for Levon here would have been the very simple knight d5. I mean, the players are on seconds here, so I'm not criticising too much. But this is great because you open up the attack on the knight, so you don't have time to take this pawn as white. And the knight's coming back to e7, it will check the king, hold everything together around the king, and then you can just start pushing pawns. Should be good for black. But Levon goes knight c2, still a good move, covers this d4 square, but now after this knight hops in here, knight b4 check, king d6, it's just slightly more complicated. This king attacks the rook. We're threatening to check here, then pick up the rook. How does black respond? Well, Levon doesn't respond. He misses the time control, his flag drops before he finishes the move, and he loses the game. So 2 games in a row of Armageddon, he's lost in this tournament to Alireza. If you want to see that first game, then click here, and see my whole Magnus Alireza playlist, click below that. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.